I grew up thinking that family was supposed to be your safe haven, that no matter what happened, your parents would always have your back. But for me, that was never the case. My older sister, Lisa, was the golden child, the one who could do no wrong. And me? I was just there, an afterthought. We lived in a quiet coastal town, the kind where everyone knew each other's business. Our home was nothing fancy, just a 2-story house with a backyard big enough for summer cookouts. My dad, Robert, worked in insurance, and my mom, Sophia, was in healthcare. On paper, we looked like your average middle-class family. In reality, everything revolved around Lisa. If Lisa failed a test, it was the teacher's fault. If I got anything less than an A, I wasn't trying hard enough. If Lisa stayed out late, my parents brushed it off. If I wanted to go out past 10, I had to provide a full report on where, why, and with whom. She got away with everything, and I got held responsible for things I didn't even do. By the time we were teenagers, it was painfully clear. Lisa had all the freedom. I had all the expectations. She could skip chores, wreck my stuff, miss family events, nothing mattered. But if I so much as forgot to take out the trash, I'd get the whole, "You're a disappointment" speech. The favoritism wasn't just emotional, it was material too. When Lisa turned 16, she got a practically new car with a giant red bow, straight out of a commercial. When I turned 16, a secondhand bicycle. When Christmas rolled around, Lisa unwrapped the latest tech and expensive gifts, while I got things like a self-help book on work ethic. I kept my head down, got good grades, worked part-time jobs, did everything right, but it never made a difference. Lisa was their priority, their pride, and I was just extra. Then came the final blow. I was still in college, struggling to pay my own tuition with part-time shifts. When my parents casually dropped the news, Lisa could live at home as long as she wanted. No rent, no responsibilities. Meanwhile, I had 2 weeks to pack my things and figure out my life. At first, I thought it was some kind of joke. But one day, I came home to find my belongings already packed cardboard boxes stacked by the door, like I was an unwanted delivery waiting to be returned. I stared at my parents. "Are you serious?" Mom didn't even look guilty. "You're an adult now, Nina. It's time for you to be independent." Independent. That word rang in my ears as I loaded my few possessions into my rusted old car, the one I had bought with my own money. Unlike Lisa's showroom perfect ride, I didn't even know where I was going. No savings, no backup plan, no family to fall back on. For the first time in my life, I was truly on my own. Driving away from the only home I had ever known should have felt like a moment of freedom, like I was breaking free from the weight of my family's constant disappointment. But all I felt was fear. My parents had made it very clear. I wasn't their problem anymore. I spent the next few hours aimlessly driving through town, trying to figure out where I could go. I didn't have enough money for a motel, and crashing on a friend's couch wasn't an option. I didn't have friends close enough to ask. Eventually, after hours of scrolling through Craigslist on my nearly dead phone, I found a room for rent in a sketchy part of town. The kind of place where the streetlights barely worked and the neighbors avoided eye contact. The apartment itself wasn't much. The walls were thin, the plumbing made noises that definitely weren't normal, and I was pretty sure the lock on my door could be picked with a paperclip. But it was cheap, and cheap was all I could afford. With rent hanging over my head, I took on 2 jobs stocking shelves at a warehouse overnight and waiting tables at a small diner during the day. The kind of place where the coffee was burnt, the regulars paid in loose change, and the cook only had 2 moods, irritated and more irritated. I barely had time to sleep, let alone think about how my life had flipped upside down. The exhaustion was constant. I lived off gas station coffee and whatever expired food the diner let us take home. My bed was a lumpy mattress I found for free online, and my only form of entertainment was scrolling through social media where I got to see Lisa's perfect life unfold in real time. She was thriving, while I was barely surviving, She was posting pictures of weekend getaways, expensive dinners, and parties in fancy downtown apartments. My parents were still bankrolling her life, paying her rent, her bills, hell, probably even her shopping sprees. And me? Not a single call, not one text. It was like I had been erased from the family entirely. One night, after an exhausting double shift at the diner, I was walking home in the rain, my hoodie soaked through, my shoes squelching with every step. I was too tired to even be miserable about it. But then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw something small curled up under the flickering neon sign of a convenience store. A dog. It was shivering, its fur matted and soaked, its ribs just slightly too visible. It looked like it had already given up. I hesitated. The last thing I needed was another responsibility. I could barely take care of myself. But then the dog lifted its head and looked at me, its big, frightened eyes locking onto mine. And just like that, I saw something painfully familiar: abandonment. I sighed. All right, buddy, let's go. Tucking the little thing under my hoodie, I hurried home, my arms tightening around it as if I could shield it from everything wrong in the world. My apartment wasn't much, but it was warm. I wrapped the dog in the cleanest towel I had, then dug through my cabinets for anything remotely dog-friendly. Scrambled eggs and stale bread weren't ideal, but the little guy devoured it like it was a 5-star meal. After eating, he curled up against my leg with a heavy sigh, like he had finally found a safe place. I knew the feeling. I told myself I wasn't keeping him, that I'd find a shelter in the morning. But as I sat there, absent-mindedly running my fingers through his damp fur, I realized something. For the first time in months, I didn't feel completely alone. I woke up the next morning to a warm weight pressed against my side. The little dog who I had mentally been calling Buddy was curled up next to me, his tiny body rising and falling with steady breaths. I told myself I wasn't keeping him, but deep down, I already knew that was a lie. The first few days were a learning curve. I had no idea how to take care of a dog, and Buddy seemed just as confused about suddenly having a person. I scraped together what little money I had left to buy some basic supplies, cheap kibble, a secondhand leash, and a food bowl from the dollar store. Every time I left for work, he watched me like I was never coming back. And every night when I dragged myself home, exhausted and smelling like burnt coffee, he was waiting by the door, tail thumping against the floor. It was the first time in my life someone was actually happy to see me. One evening, while scrolling through local Facebook pages for cheap furniture, a post caught my eye. Lost dog, please help. The picture was unmistakable. It was Buddy. My stomach twisted into knots. I stared at the screen, rereading the post over and over. A family had been searching for him for weeks. I should have felt relieved. This meant he had a home, people who cared about him. But instead, all I felt was dread. I had convinced myself I was just helping a stray, but the truth was, I had already grown attached. For the next hour, I debated what to do. A part of me wanted to pretend I hadn't seen the post, to keep Buddy and let whoever lost him assume the worst. But that wasn't who I was. If I had lost something that mattered to me, I'd want someone to do the right thing. So, with a sinking feeling in my chest, I dialed the number in the post. The voice on the other end was soft, fragile, like someone who had been waiting too long for good news. Hello? I swallowed hard. Hi, I think I found your dog. The silence stretched for a long moment, then a shaky breath. You did? Oh my God, are you sure? I'm sure, I said, glancing down at Buddy. He was stretched out on my mattress, chewing lazily on the edge of an old blanket. I found him outside a store a few weeks ago. He was cold, hungry. I took him in. The woman on the phone, Marjorie, asked if she could meet me that afternoon. I almost made an excuse, almost hung up, but I couldn't. So I said yes. Her house was on the outskirts of town, a small, weathered bungalow that had clearly been standing for decades. The yard was overgrown, and the mailbox tilted at an odd angle, like it had been knocked over and never properly fixed. I barely had time to knock before the door swung open. Marjorie stood there, wrapped in a heavy cardigan, her silver hair pinned back neatly. She was small, with that frail but tough look that only old folks seem to master. The second she saw Buddy in my arms, her hands flew to her mouth, and she started crying. I barely had time to say anything before she reached out and took him, holding him like he was the most precious thing in the world. Buddy, who had spent the past few weeks glued to my side, wagged his tail like crazy, licking her face, whining with excitement. It was like he had been waiting for this moment, just as much as she had. Marjorie finally looked up at me, her eyes wet but warm. I thought he was gone forever. I told her how I had found him curled up in the rain, how scared and hungry he had been. She listened, nodding, scratching Buddy behind the ears like she couldn't believe he was real. Then she invited me in. Her house was small but cozy, the kind of place that smelled like fresh baked cookies and old books. The furniture was worn but comfortable, the walls covered in framed photographs, most of them old, their edges curled from time. She shuffled into the kitchen and put on a pot of tea, moving slowly but deliberately, like she had done it 1,000 times before. I hadn't planned on staying long, but then she started talking. Her husband had passed away 5 years ago. Her daughter, once the center of her world, had drifted away. Calls became texts. Texts became silence. She didn't say it with bitterness, just matter-of-factly, like someone who had long accepted their place in the world. Buddy was all I had left, she admitted, running her fingers through his fur. When he went missing, I thought I'd lost everything. I sat there, listening, drinking the tea she poured for me. It was strong, almost too strong, but I drank it anyway. There was something about her presence, something familiar. The loneliness in her voice felt too close to home. Before I knew it, hours had passed, and when I finally got up to leave, she patted my hand and asked if I'd come back sometime. I told her I would, and for the first time in a long time, I actually meant it. At first, I told myself I was just checking in, that I was only stopping by to make sure Buddy was settling back in with Marjorie. But then, it became a habit. Every time I passed her street, something made me slow down, then stop. Maybe it was the way Buddy still wagged his tail when he saw me, like he hadn't forgotten me. Maybe it was the way Marjorie's face lit up when she opened the door, always greeting me with a warm smile like I was an old friend, instead of just some stranger who had returned her dog. Or maybe, deep down, I just didn't want to admit how much I needed the company too. It started small. I'd help her carry in groceries or fix the squeaky front door. Once, she asked me if I knew anything about technology because her TV remote only worked when she smacked it twice on the coffee table. She never asked for much, and she hated feeling like she was putting anyone out, but I could tell she appreciated the company. She had this way of making even a cup of tea feel like an event. She'd shuffle around the kitchen, moving slow but steady, setting out cookies on an old floral plate like she was hosting a royal guest. The place always smelled like cinnamon and something vaguely nostalgic, like a warm bakery that had been around forever. It felt safe, familiar in a way that I hadn't felt in a long time. Over time, Marjorie started telling me about her life. Nothing overly dramatic, just small pieces of a past filled with love and loss. Her daughter, Laura, had cut ties years ago over money. Marjorie didn't go into detail, but I could tell it wasn't just about finances. The hurt ran deeper than that. She talked about how she used to visit Laura's kids, how holidays used to mean something. Then one day the calls just stopped. I didn't say much, just nodded and listened, because I knew exactly what that kind of silence felt like. It wasn't lost on either of us how much our situations mirrored each other, two people left behind by the people who were supposed to love them most. One afternoon, after fixing a leaky kitchen faucet, Marjorie handed me an envelope. Inside was $20. I laughed, shaking my head. I'm not running a handyman service, you know. She gave me that stubborn look, the one I was starting to recognize, and pushed it into my hands. It's not for the work, she said. It's for the company. I took the money but later left it on her counter when she wasn't looking. The months passed like that. I was still working 2 jobs, still barely scraping by, but my visits to Marjorie's house became something I looked forward to. She made me real meals, the kind that didn't come in a microwavable tray. She let me ramble about my awful shifts, shaking her head and muttering about how young people work too hard these days. And Buddy, he still greeted me like I was his favorite person in the world, even though I knew Marjorie was his real home. Then, 6 months in, everything changed. I swung by after my warehouse shift, expecting to find Marjorie in her usual spot by the window, reading one of her mystery novels. But something felt off the second I stepped onto the porch. The front door was unlocked. A half-folded newspaper lay on the welcome mat, untouched. Inside, the house was too quiet, too still. I called her name. No answer. Then, I found her. She was collapsed on the floor by the kitchen table, her tea mug shattered beside her. Buddy sat next to her, whining softly, as if he had been trying to wake her up. I didn't think. I just moved. Dialed 911. Checked for a pulse. Felt the cold sweat break out on my back as I tried to remember every first aid step I had ever learned. The seconds stretched into hours, and for the first time in a long, long time, I was terrified of losing someone again. The hospital smelled like antiseptic and bad coffee. Too bright, too sterile, too full of people waiting for news they didn't want to hear. But I stayed. She had been unconscious when the paramedics took her, barely clinging to awareness as they loaded her into the ambulance. The doctor said it was a stroke, not a small one either. I had no idea what I was supposed to do. I wasn't family. I had no authority to make decisions. But when they asked if she had anyone to call, no one else came to mind. So I stayed. The nurses gave me weird looks when I showed up every day, probably assuming I was her granddaughter or some long-lost relative trying to make up for lost time. No one questioned it, though, and I didn't bother correcting them, because the truth was simpler and sadder. Marjorie didn't have anyone else. After a few days, she finally woke up. She was weak, disoriented, but still Marjorie. She blinked at me, then sighed like I was the most predictable thing in the world. "Of course you're here." She barely had the strength to speak, but she managed to tell me I had a good heart, that I reminded her of her late husband, how he always looked out for people, even when they didn't deserve it. I didn't know what to say to that. I wasn't some saint. I was just a girl who couldn't walk away when someone needed help. She squeezed my hand with what little strength she had left and told me I was family, whether I liked it or not. I swallowed the lump in my throat and told her she was stuck with me. She didn't make it through the night. The next morning, I sat in the empty hospital room, staring at the neatly folded blankets on the bed, trying to process the fact that she was gone. No grieving family. No long-lost daughter showing up at the last minute. It was just me and Buddy, standing in the doorway, feeling like ghosts in someone else's story. Marjorie's funeral was small. A few neighbors, an old friend from church. No family. I made sure she had flowers, that her name wasn't just another line in the obituary section of the paper, but it felt wrong how quietly the world moved on without her, like she had never been here at all. A week later, I was back to working double shifts, trying to keep myself too busy to think. Then I got the call. The number was unfamiliar. The voice on the other end even more so. "Miss Nina?" The man sounded official. The kind of guy who probably wore expensive suits and had an office with one of those leather chairs that made you feel like you were about to be told you had unpaid parking tickets from 5 years ago. "Yeah?" I said, gripping my phone tighter. "My name is Daniel Owens. I'm the executor of Marjorie's estate. Would you be available to meet this week?" For a second, I thought I had misheard him. "Her what?" "Her estate," he repeated. "She left some matters in your name. We need to go over them." I almost told him he had the wrong person. I wasn't anyone. I barely had $20 in my bank account. Why the hell would Marjorie leave anything to me? But something in my gut told me to go. Walking into the lawyer's office felt like stepping into another world. The place was polished, expensive mahogany furniture, city skyline views. I sat there, trying not to fidget, while Daniel slid a folder across the desk. "Marjorie wanted you to have this," he said simply. I opened it, expecting maybe a sentimental note, some instructions on how to take care of Buddy. Instead, I found legal documents. A lot of them. A house. Not just any house or house. Paid off. In my name. A bank account with more money than I had ever seen in my life. A plot of land outside of town that, after a quick Google search later, turned out to be worth even more than the house. I stared at the papers, my brain short-circuiting. This has to be a mistake. Daniel adjusted his glasses. It's no mistake. Marjorie made it very clear in her will. She wanted you to be taken care of. Taken care of. It hit me then she had planned this. Maybe not exactly when, but she had known her time was running out, and she had made sure I wouldn't end up struggling the way I had before. For the first time in my life, I wasn't broke. I wasn't barely scraping by. Overnight, I had gone from a girl sleeping on a Craigslist mattress to a homeowner with a bank account that didn't make me want to cry. I should have been celebrating. Instead, I felt like I had been dropped into someone else's life. I left the office in a daze, barely remembering how I got home. Well, my new home. The house looked different now, less like Marjorie's, and more like something I had to figure out how to live in. For the next few days, I adjusted, moved in my sad excuse for belongings, tried to wrap my head around the fact that I didn't have to stress about rent anymore. I even let Buddy pick a new favorite spot on the couch, like we were both trying to claim our space in this strange new reality. I stocked the fridge with actual food instead of just dollar store frozen meals. For the first time in forever, I wasn't living paycheck to paycheck, and yet I still felt like I was waiting for the other shoe to drop. Then came the problem. I should have known the peace wouldn't last. When something this good happens, people always find out. And my family? They found out. It started with a text from Lisa. "WTF? You bought a house?" I blinked at my phone, rereading the message like it would make more sense the second time. Bought? I hadn't bought anything, but then it clicked. She must have seen me. The house wasn't far from where my parents lived. Maybe a neighbor mentioned it. Maybe she had driven by and spotted me unlocking the door. And if Lisa knew, that meant my parents did too. 2 hours later, my phone rang. "Mom." I stared at the screen, knowing exactly where this was going. I didn't pick up. Instead, I watched as another text popped up. "We need to talk." Yeah, I bet we do. The next day, there was a knock at my door. I almost didn't answer, but Buddy started barking like he was auditioning for a home security commercial, and I wasn't in the mood for my new neighbors to start side-eyeing me. So I opened it, and there they were, my parents, standing on my porch like they had just casually dropped by for a cup of coffee. The last time I had seen them, they were boxing up my stuff and leaving it by the front door. Now, they were smiling, like nothing had happened. My mom had that tight, forced grin she used when she wanted something. My dad stood there awkwardly, hands shoved in his pockets, like a kid caught doing something he shouldn't. "We were in the neighborhood," Mom said. I nearly laughed. They lived 20 minutes away. This wasn't exactly on the way to Costco. I didn't invite them in. I just leaned against the doorframe, waiting. It didn't take long for them to get to the point. Mom started talking about family values, about how we used to have Sunday dinners, how things had just been so difficult back then. They never actually apologized. Instead, they acted like time had magically erased what happened, like kicking me out had just been a small misunderstanding. Then came the real reason they were here. Lisa had blown through every cent they had given her. She had dropped out of college, couldn't hold down a job, and now for the first time in her life she was struggling. And my parents? They had been covering for her this whole time, stretching their finances thin, trying to keep her afloat. Now they were looking at me, the daughter they had abandoned, the one who had never mattered, because suddenly I was the one with the resources. I almost laughed. Almost. I let them talk, watching how carefully they chose their words. The way my mom's voice softened when she brought up second chances. The way my dad nodded along like he agreed with every word she said. It was all an act. They didn't care about reconnecting with me. They cared about the house, about the money, and they thought I was still that kid desperate for their approval. I let the silence stretch before I finally spoke. I think you should go. Mom blinked, like she hadn't heard me right. Honey, we just... No, I said. You left me behind when I had nothing. You don't get to come back now that I have something. She looked genuinely shocked. Dad sighed, shaking his head like I was the unreasonable one. Lisa would have thrown a tantrum, but she wasn't here. My guess? She was too embarrassed to show up herself. They tried one more time, but I didn't budge. Eventually they left, walking back to their car in silence. I stood there, watching them drive away, waiting for the usual wave of guilt to hit me. But it never came. Instead, for the first time in a long, long time, I felt free. Story 2. I've read a lot of wild stories on the internet, family drama, relationship disasters, all kinds of ridiculous conflicts. But I never thought I'd be the one writing one. And yet, here I am, trying to process how my own parents managed to turn my relationship into some bizarre spectacle, all because they decided they don't like my girlfriend's nose. I wish I were joking. I'm 22 in my final year of college, and I've been with my girlfriend, Maya, since my freshman year. We met during orientation, clicked instantly, and never looked back. She's smart, funny, and kind, the type of person who lights up a room without even trying. She knows everything about my life, including my complicated family situation, and she's always been supportive. My parents, however, they've always been unpredictable. They had me young, barely out of high school, and never really grew out of that impulsive, unfiltered way of thinking. My mom, especially, has never held back from saying whatever crosses her mind, no matter how inappropriate. My dad, on the other hand, is quieter, but not because he's more thoughtful, just because he doesn't care enough to argue. They raised me with the expectation that I'd help support the family as soon as I could, and by the time I was 16, I was already covering most of our rent. My little sister, Lily, who's 14 now, was born when I was 8, and I've always felt more like a parent to her than our actual parents ever did. Despite all that, I never expected them to turn against Maya. At first, they seemed fine with her. They'd met her multiple times, and while my mom can be blunt, she never made any real comments about Maya's appearance. But everything changed when I mentioned that I wanted to marry her someday, not immediately, but eventually. That's when my parents suddenly decided that Maya was unacceptable. And their reasoning? We just don't like her nose. That was the best they could come up with. At first, I thought they were joking. But no, they were serious. When I pushed for an actual explanation, they scrambled for other excuses. Maya wouldn't fit into the family. She might not get along with Lily. She might not like our neighborhood. It was all nonsense, and it kept getting more ridiculous. I knew they were lying. There had to be something else behind their sudden disapproval, but they wouldn't say it outright. Then, Lily called me. She overheard them talking about Maya when they thought she wasn't around, and what she told me made everything clear. They weren't really concerned about Maya's nose. They were worried that Maya was going to trap me into marriage, have kids, and take all my money that, in their minds, should be going to them. They saw her as a threat to the financial support they'd been relying on for years. Apparently, my parents had convinced themselves that Maya was using me, that she was only with me because she knew I'd be successful, and the moment she got what she wanted, she'd push them out of my life. I was stunned, not just because of how insulting that was to Maya, but because of how little they thought of me. Like I was too stupid to recognize a gold digger, or too weak to make my own choices. I didn't know what to say. I just sat there, listening to Lily, while everything started making sense. All the weird excuses, the sudden push for me to break up with Maya, the way they kept insisting that I should focus on family instead. They weren't worried about me. They were worried about losing control over me. And in that moment, I realized something. I couldn't move back home after graduation. That had been the plan all along: move back in, keep working, save money, and eventually move out with Maya. But now, no chance. There was no way I was going to put Maya through that. And honestly, I wasn't willing to put myself through it either. I had to come up with a new plan. And I had to tell my parents the truth. But I already knew they wouldn't take it well. I spent a few days thinking everything over before calling my parents. I wanted to be calm and reasonable, to explain my decision without it turning into an all-out war. But deep down, I already knew how this was going to go. I set up a video call and told them straight I wouldn't be moving back home after graduation. I didn't mention what Lily had told me. I didn't see the point in bringing it up. I knew they'd just deny it. Instead, I framed it as a job opportunity in another city, making it sound like a practical career move rather than a reaction to their nonsense. I even reassured them that I'd keep sending financial support, so Lily wouldn't be affected. It didn't matter. They lost it. The second I said I wasn't coming back, my mom went off ranting about how I was abandoning my family, how I was choosing some girl over them, how disappointed they were in the man I'd become. My dad didn't say much, just kept shaking his head and muttering about how this is exactly what we were afraid of. They barely let me get a word in. No matter how many times I told them Maya had nothing to do with my decision, they kept insisting she was manipulating me, turning me against them. At one point, my mom actually got up and called my aunt mid-conversation, probably to start spreading the news that their ungrateful son was betraying them. I tried to stay patient. I really did. But when they started twisting everything, acting like I was cutting them off completely, when I had literally just said I would still help financially, I snapped. If you're not even going to listen, there's no point in talking. And I ended the call. The aftermath. It didn't take long for the fallout to start. My phone blew up with messages from cousins, aunts, and uncles, all repeating the same garbage my parents had told them. They were painting Maya as some manipulative gold digger, making it sound like she was trying to isolate me so she could take every penny I had. It was insane. Maya had never even asked me to stop helping my parents. She had no problem with me supporting Lily. If anything, she encouraged it. But none of that mattered. My parents had already made up their minds, and they were determined to turn as many people against us as possible. At first, I was just angry. But then, as the days passed, something else settled in. Exhaustion. I was tired of their games, tired of their guilt trips, tired of their obsession with controlling my life. And that's when I made my final decision. I was done. I wasn't going to keep letting them hold my future hostage. I wasn't going to spend my life walking on eggshells, trying to please people who only saw me as a paycheck. But there was still one problem. Lily. I knew if I cut my parents off completely, she'd be stuck in the same cycle I had been forced to take on responsibilities she never should have to handle. And I couldn't let that happen. So, I started looking for a way to get her out. And that's when everything started falling into place. Figuring out how to get Lily out of that house was the hardest part. I couldn't just take her. She was only 14, and my parents still had legal custody. But after talking things over with Maya and doing some research, I found a way. Maya's mom worked at a prestigious high school across the state. It was expensive, but children of staff could attend for next to nothing. If I could convince my parents to let Lily enroll, she'd have a way out. The tricky part was making them agree. I couldn't just say, "Hey, I know you guys are toxic, so let's send Lily somewhere safe." They'd never go for it. I had to play it smart, so I called them again. This time, I was careful. I apologized for how the last conversation went, told them I'd overreacted, and made it seem like I understood their concerns. Then, I pitched the idea. Lily could go to an incredible school, get a better education, and it wouldn't cost them anything. They were suspicious at first, but once I started talking about how great it would look for the family, how they could tell everyone that their daughter was going to a top-tier school, they warmed up to it. The final step was convincing them that, for legal reasons, it would be easier if I became Lily's guardian just for paperwork, of course. They bought it. The moment they signed over guardianship, I finalized an apartment lease near the school, and 2 weeks later, Lily and I moved out for good. No more second chances. My parents didn't realize what had happened right away. When they did, though, it was chaos. They called me nonstop, demanding answers. Then came the angry texts, the threats, the accusations. They even said they'd take me to court for stealing Lily, but no lawyer would touch their case. They had voluntarily signed the papers. At one point, my mom actually texted, "I can't believe you'd betray us like this. You owe us for everything we gave up for you." I didn't respond, because there was nothing left to say. They had lost their control over me, over Lily, and they had no one to blame but themselves. It's been a few months now, and for the first time in my life, I feel free. Lily is thriving at her new school. She's made friends, joined clubs, and actually gets to be a kid for once. I've never seen her this happy, and knowing I helped make that happen, it makes everything worth it. As for Maya and me, we got engaged. Lily helped me plan the proposal, designing a comic strip that told our love story, ending with me popping the question. It was perfect. Maya said yes. And my parents, they're struggling. Without my financial support, they're barely making ends meet. My dad had to pick up extra shifts, and from what I've heard, they've burned so many bridges with extended family that no one wants to help them. Karma has a funny way of working things out, though. Remember how my dad and mom were obsessed with Maya's nose? How they made all those nasty comments about appearances? Well, my dad made one of those comments at work a racist remark that pissed off the wrong guy. And let's just say that guy rearranged my dad's nose for him. Not gonna lie, when I heard about it, I laughed. I'm not saying violence is the answer, but if you spend your life insulting people, eventually you'll meet someone who won't just let it slide. Lily, Maya, and I are happy. That's all that matters. My parents, they made their choices, and now they have to live with them. I used to think I owed them everything, that no matter what they did, I had to keep giving and giving, but I see it differently now. Family isn't about blood. It's about who actually cares. And the people I call family, they're right here with me.